Hello everyone, wishing you all a wonderful day. Today, we're going to explore a powerful story about James standing at a life-changing crossroads. Will he choose wealth and status, or the simple happiness he has found with Diep and Nhi? Stay with us to see how this emotional journey unfolds. And if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss any upcoming videos. The late afternoon sun slipped through the kitchen window, casting a soft golden glow across the small room as Diep quietly worked on dinner. She moved with practiced ease, her hands busy at the counter as she soaked the bamboo shoots in cool water so they would lose their heat faster. Nearby, a few everyday items lay scattered on the table: glue, scissors, and an eraser, left there from Nhi's study time. The little girl sat close by, her bright voice filling the room with innocent energy as she repeated obediently, "Nhi will study well." Diep turned and smiled at her, the kind of smile that looked warm on the surface but carried something heavier underneath. Her eyes softened as she watched the child, and in a gentle voice she told her that tonight they would call Uncle James and invite him home for dinner. Nhi lit up instantly, full of confidence and excitement. To her, it was obvious. Of course, Uncle James would come home early. That simple belief made the room feel even warmer, almost like a real family dinner was already taking shape. But inside Diep's heart, a quiet uneasiness still lingered. She wiped her hands, picked up her phone, and stood still for a second before making the call. When James answered, her voice was calm, but just barely. There was a slight tremble in it as she said, "Will you come home for dinner with me and the kids tonight? I finished cooking." On the other end, James answered politely, but the reply wasn't what she had hoped for. He told her he still had work to finish and wouldn't be able to make it. Diep paused, forcing herself to swallow the disappointment before it could spill into her words. Then she turned back to Nhi and said as gently as she could, "Uncle James is busy, so we'll eat first, okay?" Nhi accepted it with the simple understanding of a child. But Diep stood there, holding the phone for a moment longer. In that quiet instant, she felt something difficult to name. It was as if ordinary life, work, responsibilities, daily struggles, was slowly stretching the fragile ties between people, dividing their feelings with invisible distance. She remained still in the kitchen, looking out toward the yard, where the evening shadows had started to settle. Hope was still there, but it lived side by side with a sadness she could not ignore. At that same time, James stepped into a meeting space dressed in a neat, well-fitted suit. He looked sharp, and his business partner noticed immediately, complimenting him with a smile on how handsome he looked that day. The conversation started lightly, almost casually, touching first on recent life and small changes. James mentioned that he had once planned to move away, but in the end, he had decided to stay longer. The partner listened, then gently shifted the subject toward the past. They spoke openly about knowing who James used to be, that he had once managed the company where BA worked, that he had been capable, hard-working, and driven, and that after leaving prison, he had changed in ways that were impossible not to notice. Then, with a more serious tone, they placed something unexpected in front of him. They said they were preparing to leave their current role, which meant an important position would soon be vacant. Because of James's experience, they wanted him to take over and manage the two woodwork shops in Xuan Van. For a second, James just stared at them. The offer was real, serious, rare, big enough to change everything. Surprise flashed across his face, followed quickly by hesitation. He wasn't ready for the weight of what he had just heard. When he finally spoke, his voice came out lower than usual, heavy with uncertainty. "I'm not ready to take on that job yet." The answer was honest, but it didn't settle anything inside him. His thoughts were already in turmoil. On one side was a life-changing opportunity, the kind of position that could restore income, status, and perhaps even some dignity in the eyes of others. On the other side was fear. Fear of going back to the pressure, the expectations, the version of life he had only just escaped. The partner tried to persuade him, speaking patiently and carefully, but James could only give a small shake of his head. He sat there, caught in the middle of a decision that felt powerful enough to rearrange his entire future. Back at home, the dinner table glowed under a warm yellow light. It was simple, modest, and familiar. Diep and Nhi sat across from each other, and for the moment, the world seemed to narrow down to just the two of them and the meal in front of them. Diep carefully peeled the bamboo shoots piece by piece, placing them into Nhi's bowl with a softness that made every gesture feel like care made visible. "Eat up," she said. "I peeled it for you." Nhi took a bite and reacted to the slight bitterness of the bamboo shoot, surprised at first, but then smiled anyway. She said she still liked it. A moment later, she asked for more rice and proudly announced that tonight she wanted to eat 2 bowls. Diep laughed under her breath, pleased, and continued peeling more for her. Even though the bamboo shoots had already cooled, she still worried they might be too hot for the child. It was such a small scene, but it carried a deep tenderness. Nhi happily praised the food, while Diep kept serving her, watching every little expression, making sure she ate well. In those quiet moments, Diep felt a simple joy settle over her, the joy of taking care of someone, of nurturing, of being needed. It felt, for a brief time, like the loneliness from James's rejected call had faded into the background. Still, it had not disappeared completely. Beneath her calm face, she remained uneasy. James was out there somewhere, wrapped up in work and decisions much bigger than this dinner table. She could feel that something important was shifting in his life, and maybe in hers too. The meal ended with Nhi's childish laughter echoing through the house. But Diep knew how delicate that happiness really was. Life had a way of changing things quickly. James's choices could sweep through their little world at any time. Meanwhile, James's conversation continued, growing heavier with every passing minute. His partner once again stressed how valuable this opportunity was. They pointed out that a role like this could solve so many of his problems at once: money, reputation, security, even the prejudice that still followed him after prison. Anyone else would be eager to accept, but James stayed firm. He admitted the truth of his situation in a low, sorrowful voice. After getting out, his family had already fallen apart. There were no assets left, no real foundation waiting for him. Everything had been scattered. As he spoke, his words revealed not only regret, but also a deep helplessness that he rarely allowed others to see. The partner kept trying. They reminded him that not everyone got handed a chance like this. But James only thanked them quietly and shook his head again. Inside, his thoughts were tangled. He couldn't ignore the irony of it all. This was someone who hadn't always treated him kindly in the past, and yet now they were offering him one of the biggest chances of his life. That made the whole thing even harder to process. Gratitude and suspicion, hope and fear, pride and exhaustion, all of it collided inside him at once. Silence settled between them. James lowered his gaze and looked at his hands, rough now, hardened by manual labor, nothing like the hands of the man he used to be. He wondered, not for the first time, whether he still had what it took to return to management. Could he step back into that demanding world and carry its weight again? Or had he already become someone else entirely, a man of the soil, a farmer, a person who now understood life through sweat, sun, and tired muscles instead of meetings and paperwork? That question stayed with him, heavy and unanswered. After a long pause, James's partner leaned back and spoke more softly, no longer trying to convince him with position or money alone. Instead, they began talking about life in a way James had not expected. They said that in the end, money and property were only material things. Useful, yes, sometimes necessary, but never the whole meaning of a person's life. What mattered more, they said, was health, peace of mind, and the kind of happiness that made each day worth living. Then they explained why they had chosen to step away from the company in the first place. The workshops, the wealth, the business empire, none of it truly belonged to them in spirit. It all came from their father, a man who had always controlled everything, deciding every direction their life should take. From the outside, it looked like success, but inside, it felt like a cage. Their voice grew quieter, more personal, as they admitted that what they really wanted was not another title or bigger authority. What they wanted was freedom. They wanted to return to a simpler life, something closer to what James had found. They talked about the days they had spent digging bamboo shoots and working in the garden with Diep. The work was hard, exhausting even, but strangely satisfying. It made their body ache, yet their mind felt lighter. For the first time in a long while, they had felt healthy, peaceful, and outside the shadow of their father's control. James listened closely, his expression changing little by little. The words touched something inside him because they were not about business anymore. They were about the cost of a life that looked successful from the outside but felt empty within. The partner admitted that farming was tiring and unpredictable, and there were no guarantees in that kind of life either. But if a person could wake up with peace in their chest and go to sleep without feeling chained, then maybe that was enough. The distance between them softened. What had begun as a tense conversation about an offer slowly turned into something more honest. They were no longer just talking about jobs or future plans. They were talking about what kind of life was worth protecting. As James sat there, listening, his heart began to shift. Images started forming in his mind with surprising clarity. Diep standing in the kitchen under the evening light, Nhi talking in her sweet, eager voice, the small table at home, the sound of laughter in the yard, the simple rhythm of a life that was hard but real. Those fragments rose inside him, one after another, and suddenly, the workshops in Xuanvan felt farther away, almost like a road that belonged to someone he used to be. After a while, James opened up more fully about his current life with Diep. His voice softened as he spoke, and for the first time that evening, there was a trace of a smile in it. He recalled his very first day digging bamboo shoots. By the time he got home, his whole body had been aching. He had been so exhausted that after taking a shower, he went straight to bed without even thinking. At the time, it felt almost unbearable. But after a few days, then a few weeks, something changed. His body grew stronger. His arms and legs became more solid. He began waking up early, heading out before the sun got too hot, working with his hands instead of being buried under documents and endless pressure. He admitted that before leaving his old life, he had managed to save a little money. That made things easier. At least for now, there were no overwhelming debts crushing him. He was not rich, and the future was uncertain. But the burden on his shoulders no longer felt suffocating. Then he said something even quieter, something more honest. He still didn't know whether this choice was truly the right one. He didn't know if one day he might look back and regret giving up such a big chance. But right now, in this moment, he felt happy. Not triumphant, not secure, just genuinely happy. His partner looked at him and offered a faint, understanding smile. They congratulated him and said they hoped he would never have to live with regret. James nodded, but that blessing did not erase the conflict inside him. It only made it clearer. He was standing at a crossroads. One path led back toward management, money, and the possibility of rebuilding status. The other led toward an ordinary life beside Diep and Nhi, full of sweat, uncertainty, and modest joys. Neither path was easy. Both demanded sacrifice. And yet, when he closed his eyes, for even a second, it was not the workshops he saw first. It was Diep. It was Nhi. That realization stayed with him. Later, under the bright light of the garden's sun, life seemed to answer him in a language much simpler than words. James, Diep, and Nhi worked side by side in the yard. The gourd plants had grown enough that it was almost time to build the trellis for them. Water pipes had to be set up, the soil had to be dug through, and they needed to decide how to bury the hose underground so the water source could be shared properly. The ground was dry and hard, stubborn under the shovel, the kind of earth that looked more suitable for sweet potatoes than anything delicate. But none of them complained much. Nhi was excited from the beginning. She asked over and over if she could help water the plants. When James and Diep started burying the pipe, she hurried over to push soil in with her small hands, determined to contribute however she could. Before long, she admitted she was tired, her face already damp with sweat. But she was smiling as she said it. In her straightforward way, she declared that later in life she would study hard so she could do brain work instead of tiring labor like this. But for now, she still wanted to help Diep and James. Her words made both adults laugh. The three of them kept working, talking, and teasing one another in the sunlight. Sweat ran down their faces, their clothes clung to their backs, and the work moved slowly because the ground refused to cooperate. Yet in their eyes, there was a rare brightness. It was the kind of joy that came not from comfort, but from sharing effort together. Diep glanced at James from time to time, her eyes warm and full of quiet feeling. She did not say much, but her expression carried more than words could. James noticed, and in those small glances, in the child's laughter, in the rhythm of digging, lifting, burying, and adjusting the hose, he felt a deep calm settle over him, something he had not felt in a very long time. This was not an impressive life by most people's standards. There were no polished shoes here, no offices, no titles, no negotiations about positions of power. There was only dirt, sunlight, aching muscles, and two people beside him who somehow made all of it feel meaningful. As the work went on, James realized that these ordinary moments were not small at all. They were, in fact, the very heart of what he had been missing. Standing side by side with Diep and Nhi, doing manual labor in the garden, he finally understood the value of affection more clearly than ever before. This little family they were building, fragile, imperfect, unfinished, had become something precious. When the work was done, the three of them headed back toward home together to prepare for dinner. Their steps were tired, but no one seemed in a hurry. The evening light stretched across the yard, and for a while, no one said anything. James lingered for a moment in the middle of the garden, looking around at the rough soil, the pipes, the young plants, and the path leading back to the house. The major decision still had not left his mind. The offer from the partner was still real. The choice still waited for him. His heart was not fully at peace, and the future remained uncertain. But in that moment, standing there with the sounds of Diep and Nhi nearby, simple happiness pulled at him with quiet strength. It drew him closer, not to status, not to ambition, but to the life that was slowly taking shape beside them. And for the first time, that gentle pull felt stronger than all the noise of the world outside.